It wasn't the excuses that finally broke you. It was the hope you built inside them. The quiet, desperate prayer that this time, the words would finally match the reality you felt slipping away. It wasn't her excuses that hurt you. It was the fact that you believed them. You called it patience. You called it understanding. But in the silence that followed your acceptance, you knew the truth. You were not waiting for them. You were waiting for yourself to stop believing a story you knew was already over. This is not a story about being deceived. It is a story about consent. The quiet, painful agreement to look away from what you knew to be true, all for the sake of preserving a connection that was already gone. We can talk for hours about their behavior, about the words they used and the promises they broke. We can dissect their every action and inaction. But the heart of the matter, the real source of the ache that settles in your chest in the middle of the night, isn't about them. It is about you. It is about the moment you felt the truth in your gut. A cold, hard stone of certainty, and chose to swallow it. The central pain you're carrying isn't their rejection. It is the sting of self-betrayal. It's the shame of realizing you were an accomplice in your own heartbreak. You held the map upside down and convinced yourself you weren't lost. You heard the discordant note in their symphony and pretended it was part of the song. You did this not because you were foolish or weak or blind. You did it because the need for the connection felt more urgent than the need for the truth. You handed them the alibi, you validated the excuse, you nodded when every cell in your body was screaming no. And in doing so, you abandoned yourself long before they ever had the chance to leave. This is where the real wound lies. Not in the goodbye that was said, but in the countless times you said it's okay to a truth that was anything but. Hope, in its purest form, is a lifeline. It is the light we search for in the darkness, the anchor in a storm. But for you, in this connection, hope became something else entirely. It became a weapon turned inward, a tool for self-inflicted silence. You took their stories, the late nights at work that stretched into dawn, the emotional unavailability they wore like a shield, the vague and shimmering promises of a future that never seemed to get any closer, and you treated them as fact. Each excuse was a thread, and you diligently wove them together, creating what you thought was a safety net. You convinced yourself it would catch you if you fell. Instead, you slowly, methodically, built yourself a cage. You lined the bars with understanding and polished them with patience, all while the quiet, knowing part of you rattled the lock, begging to be let out. This is the anatomy of self-betrayal. It is a slow and quiet process, not a single dramatic event. It is the subtle trade-off we make when our primal need for attachment becomes more powerful than our allegiance to ourselves. There is a part of us, ancient and deep, that believes emotional starvation is worse than being fed poison. And so you ate. You consumed the plausible lies and the half-truths because the emptiness of the alternative felt unbearable. Every time you nodded and said, "I get it," you performed a tiny act of severance from your own intuition. That gut feeling, that internal alarm that hums with a low, persistent frequency when things are wrong, was muted. You learned to turn the volume down, telling yourself it was just anxiety or past trauma or insecurity. You told yourself it was your problem to solve. The wound isn't simply that they lied. The wound is that you knew, on some level you always knew, and you chose to stay in the warmth of the fire, pretending you couldn't smell the smoke. They handed you the blueprint for a cathedral. It wasn't just a simple sketch. It was a masterpiece of potential, detailed with promises of shared futures, rooms filled with laughter, and a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. They spoke of this life with such conviction that you could almost feel the phantom weight of the front door key in your palm. You studied the lines and the measurements, memorized the layout, and fell in love with the light that would pour through windows that hadn't been built yet. Their words were the only materials they ever offered, but you treated them like stone and timber. You believed because the design was beautiful and the architect was charming, and the thought of living anywhere else felt like settling for less. But belief, no matter how powerful, cannot turn paper into reality. Believing their excuses was the act of standing alone in that empty, windswept field, clutching the blueprint to your chest as if it could shield you from the cold. It was the act of pointing to the barren ground and telling yourself, and anyone who would listen, that the house was real. It was just hidden by a temporary fog or obscured by the harshness of the midday sun. The profound ache you feel now is not just the sting of a broken promise. It is the deep, bone-wearying exhaustion that comes from having been the sole architect, builder, and resident of a fantasy. You weren't just lied to. You were the one who showed up every day with a hammer and no nails, trying to build a fortress on barren ground. The silence you are left with now is not merely the sound of their absence. It is the hollow echo of the wind sweeping through the rooms of a house that was never there, a home that existed only in the fragile, hopeful architecture of your own mind. I understand. You said those words so many times they became a reflex, a soft landing place you offered them whenever their actions fell short. You thought it was an expression of compassion, a sign of your emotional depth and strength. When they disappeared for days and returned with a vague story about stress, you said, I understand. When they spoke of their fear of commitment as an unconquerable beast, you said, I understand. You believed you were offering a safe harbor, a space free of judgment where they could finally heal and open up. You saw yourself as the patient gardener, tending to a damaged plant, believing that with enough tenderness, it would eventually turn towards the sun. You mistook their inconsistency for complexity and your empathy for the cure. In reality, your understanding became their most reliable alibi. For the person committed to their own emotional distance, an overly empathetic partner is not a gift. It is an escape hatch. Every time you accepted their excuse without question, you inadvertently took responsibility for their behavior. You absorbed the emotional weight of their choices. Their lack of presence wasn't a failure on their part. It became a burden for your empathy to carry. You told yourself their distance was a symptom of their pain, not a reflection of their priorities. Your compassion, your greatest strength, was weaponized. It became the key that unlocked their cage, allowing them to escape accountability time and time again, leaving you alone in the room, holding the emotional debt they refused to pay. Your understanding didn't build a bridge toward them. It paved their road away from you, and they walked it without ever looking back. When they finally delivered that hollow, weightless phrase, "It's not you, it's me," it wasn't just a cliché that hurt you. For you, it was a sound that echoed through the empty hallways of your own history. It was a frequency you recognized deep in your bones, one that vibrated with the memory of a much older, more foundational silence. The discomfort, the confusion, the lingering sense of being fundamentally too much or not enough was not a new feeling. It was a ghost you had lived with for years, and their words simply gave it a new name and a new face. This is how their flimsy excuses managed to inflict such a deep and resonant wound. They didn't create the pain, they activated it. This pattern of accepting confusing explanations for a lack of love was not born in this relationship. It was a skill you were forced to learn in childhood. When you were young, you may have learned to accept the unacceptable. You learned that the raw, simple truth, that a parent was not present, not attuned, not available, was far too devastating to confront directly. So you accepted the stories you were told, or the ones you told yourself. They're just busy. They're just tired. They have a lot on their minds. You became an expert at creating a narrative to soften the sharp, terrifying edges of emotional neglect. You learned that it was safer to believe a confusing reason than to face the void of no reason at all. Decades later, their excuses fit perfectly into this well-worn groove in your heart. You believed them not because they were convincing, but because the feeling they produced was tragically familiar. The pain was so profound because it was never just about them. It was about every time you were made to feel that love was a complex equation you simply weren't smart enough to solve. Think back to those circular conversations, the ones that left you feeling drained, unheard, and desperate. Recall the late-night pleas for clarity, the carefully constructed arguments you rehearsed in your mind, the desperate attempts to make them see how their actions were wounding you. Now, understand this, you were not fighting with the person in front of you. You were in a heated, passionate, soul-crushing argument with a ghost. You were arguing with the idealized version you met in the beginning, the one who was present, engaged, and full of promise. You were pleading with the person you saw in fleeting glimpses of vulnerability, the partner they swore they wanted to be. You were negotiating with their potential, not their reality. This is why every conversation felt like you were speaking a different language. You were sending messages to a phone that had long been disconnected. You would hit send, and then wait, staring at the screen, knowing deep down that no one was on the other end. But you kept typing, you kept calling, you kept pleading into the void. Because the act of stopping, the act of finally putting the phone down, was a final admission. It was the acceptance that the person you were so desperately trying to reach, the one whose love felt like coming home, either never really existed or was gone for good. The arguments weren't about finding a solution. They were a frantic attempt to keep the connection alive, even if it was only a connection to an echo. The exhaustion you feel is the result of fighting a war on two fronts. One against their indifference, and a far more brutal one against the beautiful, heartbreaking phantom you kept alive in your own mind. You saw their emotional unavailability not as a wall, but as a mountain to be climbed. You viewed their inconsistencies not as a warning sign, but as a complex puzzle only you were patient enough to solve. In the quiet, unlit laboratory of your heart, you took on the mystical and exhausting role of the alchemist. You were convinced that your love, your bottomless patience, your unwavering understanding could be the philosopher's stone, the sacred element that would finally transmute their emotional lead into relational gold. This belief wasn't just passive hope. It was a job. You worked at it tirelessly. You collected their breadcrumbs of affection and analyzed them like rare minerals, seeing signs of progress where there were only fleeting moments of contact. You celebrated their rare displays of vulnerability as major breakthroughs, proof that your magic was working. The collapse of the alchemist is never a loud explosion. It is a slow, creeping dawn of realization. It happens on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, or in the dead of night when you wake up for no reason. It is the moment you finally look down at your own hands and see them not as powerful tools of transformation, but as they truly are, raw, empty, and aching from trying to shape something that refuses to be shaped. The devastating epiphany is not that you failed, but that the experiment was flawed from the start. They were never a project to be fixed. Their excuses were never secret pleas for you to try harder. They were simply a statement of fact, a description of the stone you were holding. And the exhaustion that finally brings you to your knees is the soul-deep weariness of a magician who has run out of tricks, realizing they have spent all their energy trying to perform magic on something that was content, all along, to simply be a stone. The most dangerous lies are not the bold, outrageous ones. Those are easy to spot, easy to dismiss. The true poison, the kind that keeps you hooked long after you should have walked away, is the poison of plausibility. It is the venom found in the almost truth. It lives in the space after the word, but. I do care about you, but my life is a mess right now. I miss you terribly. I'm just terrified of getting close to anyone. These phrases are masterpieces of emotional manipulation, whether intentional or not. They are designed to give you just enough validation to keep you invested, while simultaneously providing a rock-solid excuse for the lack of any real commitment or action. They are not outright lies. They are carefully constructed half-truths that feed your hope and starve your reality. This is the emotional equivalent of being chained to a slot machine in a dark casino, one that is programmed to pay out just enough, just rarely enough, to keep you pulling the lever. Each plausible excuse is a small jackpot of hope, a handful of coins that makes you forget the fortune you've already lost. You would cling to the first half of the sentence, "I do care about you," because it was the part your heart so desperately needed to hear. You treated it as the whole truth, and the second half as a temporary problem to be solved, a circumstance to be overcome. This dynamic keeps you in a state of permanent anticipation, a torturous emotional purgatory where you are never fully chosen, but never fully released. It's a hook that digs deeper the more you struggle, because it is baited with the most addictive substance of all, the belief that things could be different, if only you wait long enough. After the final excuse is given and the silence becomes a permanent resident in your life, a new and obsessive role takes over. The alchemist puts away his tools, the gambler walks away from the slot machine, and the detective arrives. Your heart becomes a cold case, and you appoint yourself lead investigator. This is the stage of painful archaeology. You begin sifting through the digital ruins of what you had, scrolling back months, even years, through old messages. You examine the punctuation in a text, searching for hidden meaning. You analyze the tone of an old email, looking for a flicker of warmth you might have missed. You stare at a photograph of the two of you, trying to determine if the smile in their eyes was genuine or simply a well-rehearsed performance. You are not looking for memories, you are looking for evidence. You are searching for definitive proof that the love you invested in was real, that the narrative you chose to believe was based on fact. This compulsive investigation is a direct symptom of having believed their plausible lies for so long. You are still trying to make their story make sense. You are desperately searching for clues to support the false narrative because the alternative is simply too devastating to accept. The simple, brutal truth that their actions were the only clue that ever mattered feels like a verdict against your own judgment. It would mean admitting that you saw the evidence of their withdrawal all along and chose to ignore it. So you hunt for ghosts in the machine, believing that if you can just find that one validating message, that one piece of irrefutable proof of their love, then your own hope will have been justified. But this is a search that only leads you deeper into the past, an investigation where the detective is also the victim, forever trapped at the scene of the crime, refusing to see the one clue that solves the entire case. They are gone. The most profound wound is not the one they inflicted. It is the one you now inflict upon yourself, in the silent, merciless courtroom of your own mind. After the detective gives up the search, the trial begins. There is no jury, no audience, only you. You are the prosecutor, the defender, the judge, and the one in the dock accused of the highest crime, betraying your own knowing. The trial happens in the quiet moments, in the car, in the shower, in the seconds before sleep, when there are no distractions left to save you from your own cross-examination. One part of you, the prosecutor, is cold and relentless. It presents the evidence with brutal clarity. The unanswered texts, the hollow promises, the feeling in your gut you chose to ignore. It screams, you knew. You knew their words were empty. You felt the distance grow. You knew they were lying. And the other part of you, the defender, is small and exhausted. It has no real evidence to offer, only a motive. It whispers with a voice full of shame, "But I wanted it to be true. I wanted it so badly." This is the crux of the agony. The real pain is not that you were fooled by a convincing performance. The real pain is the sickening realization that you were a willing participant in the deception. You held the flashlight for them while they dug the hole, because the darkness of being alone felt infinitely more terrifying than the certainty of the fall. This internal conflict is a civil war inside a heart that chose a beautiful, impossible lie over a simple, painful truth. The shame you carry is not for loving them. It is for the moment you looked your own intuition in the eye and chose to look away. Long before the end, you became your own unreliable weatherman. You took on the job of forecasting the emotional climate of your relationship, and your only prediction was sunshine. The data was telling you a different story. The barometric pressure was dropping for months, A heavy feeling in the air you could sense every time a plan was canceled, a text went unanswered, or their energy felt distant and cold. The storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and ominous, visible to anyone who dared to look up from the ground. But you refused. You kept your gaze fixed on a forecast of your own making, a beautiful, sun-drenched map that existed only in your head. You told yourself it was just a passing shower, a temporary cold front that would soon clear. You insisted the chill you felt was just a breeze. Believing their excuses was an act of deliberate meteorological denial. It was a desperate attempt to control a climate that was already turning on you, a refusal to accept that the season was changing. You dressed for a warm, summer day while the winds howled and the sky grew dark. You packed a picnic while the first drops of rain began to fall. This wasn't optimism. It was an act of emotional delusion, a deep-seated refusal to be left stranded in a storm. And so, when the downpour finally came, when the reality of their absence could no longer be denied, you were left completely exposed. The shock wasn't the rain itself. It was the chilling realization that you had been holding the umbrella upside down the entire time, drenched in a storm that you, and only you, had refused to see coming. The path out of this wreckage does not begin with a final analysis of their motives. It doesn't begin with understanding their childhood, their fears, or their inability to love. The real healing does not start when you finally have the perfect explanation for why they were the way they were. It begins on much quieter, more sacred ground. It starts when you finally turn the full, unwavering light of your attention inward and ask the only question that has ever mattered: why did I believe them? The journey forward is not about building higher walls to keep others out, but about dismantling the internal walls that have kept you from yourself. It is about finally coming home. You cannot find a sense of belonging with someone else by abandoning the home within your own body. For so long, you treated your intuition like a paranoid whisper, a voice to be quieted and corrected. You were trained, perhaps long ago, to trust external validation over your own internal knowing. This homecoming is a slow, deliberate process. It is learning to listen again. It is treating that quiet hum of certainty in your gut not as an inconvenience, but as your most loyal and trusted guide. It is the moment you stop asking them for the truth and realize it has been inside you all along, waiting patiently in the silence beneath the noise of your hope and your fear. The compass needle that has been spinning wildly for years finally settles, not because the storm outside has passed, but because you have finally learned to hold it steady. The path forward is not about hardening your heart. It is about learning to trust it for the first time and allowing it finally to lead you back to yourself. You have lived with the ghost of their excuses for long enough. We've put together a short guide to help you name the patterns of self-abandonment and take the first real breath after the story is over. It's not about solutions. It's about recognition. It's free and it's honest. The link is in the description. You knew the truth long before the excuses, but you needed time to face it. If now is that time, the next step begins somewhere else. When you're ready to leave the echo chamber behind, that door is waiting.